Okay, we will start. As you know, today the center is in the social relations in urban planning and social participation in architecture and planning. The 3 days are very interrelated, and just 2 or 3 practical questions. Don't forget the computers and the bags, that it's dangerous to leave computers and bags in the room. Because we have a lot of times problems with that. Another practical question is, remember 3 o'clock in the school starts the parallel sessions, and today at 8 there is the final party. There is a party at the school at 8 o'clock. Always there is the enormous difficulty to make a synthesis of the whole Congress just in 20 minutes or at the end of today after the coffee break. We have different possibilities to improve this, not here, but through different practical ways. Some coordinators of tables of sessions sent to me the email with conclusions or with some of the main ideas that were out in the discussions. This is one possibility. Any person in the Congress can send an email to us explaining this has been very good, this is not so good, this discussion for me, because I know it's impossible the participation of everybody. You can send the mails to the newsletter or to myself, no problem at all. Also this year there is a big intensive course, next week, that is the first time that a lot of people that is in this course. No. Before last year were 10 persons and this year is 50 persons. This is another way to make the conclusions, because you cannot improvise the conclusions mind, line and society very fast. It's very difficult. In the course we can devote hours to different concrete aspects of architecture and production of architecture, or about the dissertations, PhD dissertations that are now in a lot of countries that can be discussed and presented in the intensive course. No? This is another way to say that, because there are sometimes say, well, it's not necessary to be stressed. The stress that we need to make conclusions on a very complicated thing. We have 5 minutes to find the final idea that can solve everything. I don't believe that. No. It's open, everybody can participate, but I advise that there is no time normally. The head of this building, of the Association of Architects, inform us that he will come here to participate. He likes a lot to participate in the discussion at the end about the involvement, the commitment of the Catalan Association of Architects in the research, and especially in the renewal of buildings and social participation. No? That objects that will be after the 2 lectures. We will have the coffee break. Then after we will have the final discussion and some ideas coming from the Association of the Catalan Association of Architects, and coming from anybody. Okay, then Carol Després is the first speaker. She is doing a very special work because he can make the bridge between architectural design and social science very, very well, because she knows the difficulties of this, practical and theoretical. And I think that this is a subject that needs a lot of work, and as I hope dissertations on that. Not social science and architectural design in one side and architectural design, but the link between both that needs to be developed not only at the theoretical level, but also as a practical level. Because sometimes the link is discussed in theory and then in practice work in a very different way. Then this connection, I think that she has done a very important work at this level in practical interrelation between architectural design and social science, and now she is a researcher in this field. And she in Canada is one of the countries that seems they are pushing more in this direction, not in Spain, because that means that the university, and the city hall, and the politicians are making joint work. There is a coaction between political administration and university, not in Spain at all. And the agencies of urban planning in Catalonia, for instance, are not collaborating with the university in a lot of aspects of urbanistic decisions. That is what in practice should be done. Okay, then Carol can start. Thank you very much for another possibility.
I think this is working. How much time do I have, Joseph? How much time?
Yeah, 50 minutes, for instance.
50?
50.
Okay. Buenos días, bon dia, good morning. I want to first start by thanking Professor Montagnula to have invited me to speak with this distinguished panel. It's an honor for me. I have a lot of respect for Joseph as a pioneer, really a pioneer in the field of people environment research, of making links between research and design when there was not that many people, but it was Kevin Lynch in the United States, as we talk. But I still use your concept of appropriation as a fundamental concept to teach my graduate student. I'm not sure anybody knows that it's from you, though. So I'm a professor of architecture at Laval University in Quebec, the French part of Canada. I'm trained in architecture. I have a PhD in environment behavior studies, or people-environment relation. I teach programming and design studio, an advanced studio, every year. I teach human aspect of urban form, and I teach research method. I've been teaching research method for a long time. And let me see if this works. I have to manipulate two things at once here. I'm the director of the interdisciplinary research group on suburb, which I co-founded in 2001 with colleagues in sociology and urban design. We are about 10 professors. You see the discipline on the screen. And about 20 students every year, so maybe 30 people, plus studio students that are involved, about 30 other students involved every year. GERBA's mission is to inform the future of post-war suburbs that are aging socially and physically. We develop a transdisciplinary, let me see, I have to do this. We develop a transdisciplinary research program where we make rotation between scientific research, design research, and action-oriented research. All of this to inform aging post-war suburb and their retrofitting. So you can see the discipline with where we are producing knowledge, and in terms of action-oriented research, we mostly conduct participatory design processes and elaborate decision aid tools to help a decision maker take better decisions. So, in the last 15 years, we've produced books in French in a very vulgarized way of writing that are addressed to decision makers, civil servants. The population can understand what they read, and also the student. So, of course, when you want to talk to your local people, you publish in the language that is used locally. We also do design research. As I said, I teach a advanced programming design studio. I've been working on hospital design, housing for the elderly, and now I'm on school design. This is an example of a new typology of multifunctional room designed for the renovation of the school building in Quebec. I also do action research. I won't talk much about it because Louis Chala gave such a good talk about all the possibility there is to do that type of collaborative processes. And I know several of you in the room, I've looked at the program, are doing this type of collaborative community, interdisciplinary studio, name it the way you want. And I find it so refreshing to see that the studio teaching is also changing. Because the aging of post-war suburb is what is called a wicked problem, because it is multidimensional, multi-sectorial, multi-stakes, it is too complex to be tackled by architects alone. We develop an approach that combines the implication of 4 types of knowledge that you see on the screen. I have used this model over and over to structure my research project and the collaborative processes. So you see, you have 4 types of knowledge. You have the scientific rationality and knowledge, which is, I put it in question mark, what is true, because it's what is true in science at a certain time of history. And there is the technical rationality, what is possible, and for example, in hospital, nurses that have been working for 30 years will tell you a lot about what's possible. Or people plowing the snow in a city will tell you a lot about what is possible. So this is called technical or operational knowledge. There is also the ethical knowledge, which is brought by, most of the time, by the people, by the community organization, by the elected official, not so much these days, but it should. And the aesthetic rationality, which is shared by artists, architects, but also with the population who have their own representation of what is beautiful. And the idea is not to consult these people one after the other, but to consult them together. And I'm sure those of you conducting participatory process have experienced this thing that a 5th type of knowledge emerged, which is in the center, which is more than the sum of these 4 types of knowledge. And once you experience that, you know you have to continue working like that. So those of you who are interested in that, I published a chapter on this transdisciplinary approach. And I explained there why I believe architect and planning are predisposed discipline to do transdisciplinarity. I call ourselves undisciplined disciplines, because planning is multi-sectorial in terms of the type of knowledge that is taught to students. Professors come from different backgrounds. And architecture, it's the opposite. Professors come usually from architectural background, but problem solving involves different type of knowledge. So we're very good at directing collaborative processes. Designers use 3 modes of reasoning when they do a problem solving, and it combines induction and deduction. And this is well known to researchers concerned with what the reality is and what the reality should be. You know, you go on a site, and from the site you will induce induction, some rules, and collaborative processes teach us a lot about that. Deduction is more about generalizable knowledge, so you will look more into the quantitative, hypothetical deductive research to make from generalizable knowledge to infer some principle. But designers use a third type of mode of reasoning when they do problem solving, which is abduction. Jean-Louis Lemoyne wrote about that in France. And it's this capacity to decide about what should be, this intelligent intuition that comes from an interaction between the three modes of knowledge. Designer must thus be trained to work with different type of expert to retrieve this type of information, induction and deduction, the four type of people I showed you in the previous slide. Design is thus capable of a constructive dialogue with other domains of knowledge, including health, natural, and social human sciences. I'm going to talk a little more about that today. In 2014, I spoke at the same conference about avenues for linking design and research. And my early reflection evolved and were just published in the Handbook of Environmental Psychology. 3 years later, I'm on the same mission, although this time I have chosen to speak about the scarcity, the rarity of architects conducting research associated with the contribution of health, the contribution of the built environment to health and well-being. I want to be clear. I'm not proposing to go back to using research as was proposed in the 70s. You're probably all too young to remember that. But you and I will remember that it was supposed that with good research, you would do good design. And we all know that it was a simplistic view of what design is all about. And thanks to John Zeisel in his book Inquiry by Design in the 80s, we started adopting an iterative model of design where we understand that different type of knowledge are needed at different type of the problem-solving process. So today I'm going to talk about one of the three types of knowledge mentioned in the title of this conference, that is the dialogic knowledge, the one apt at informing and assessing design decision. However, I'm not either going to talk about architect as knowledge user today, which I did the last time I came here. I'm going to talk about architects as knowledge producer. Again, don't think I'm just research-oriented. I do a lot of, as Joseph has mentioned, I do a lot of design and collaborative process with stakeholders. But today, I will talk about the specific place of architects in health and well-being research. So I will focus today on scientific peer-reviewed journals, so research journals that are peer-reviewed only. So why do we need scientific evidence? The built environment and the urban infrastructure inherited from post-World War II are worn out. We are arriving at a stage, you know, after World War II, we call that the Great 30s, from 1945 and 1975. It was an amazing period in terms of economic and demographic development, and so much was built. Well, you know, a cycle in architecture is about 50 years. We're getting there. And in Quebec, at least, where we had the great, what we call the quiet revolution in the 60s, where everything was built. But these buildings are all 50 years old or more now. And it's hospital and street infrastructure, it's housing, name it, schools. Everything has to be remodeled at once. It's very exciting for architects. But at the same time, one question we must bear is, can we do better? Can we avoid the mistake that were made in that period where everything was constructed so quick without thinking too much? Can we do better? So this unavoidable cycle of renovation and refurbishment is started with colossal sums of money that will be invested by government in the decades ahead. In Quebec, it's already started. At the heart of these operations, a desire to do better, answering the challenge posed by sustainable development. Of course, doing better is to try to take into consideration the three pillars of sustainable development, the social, economic, and environmental sustainability. So the question is, scientific evidence might help get the government most return on their money. And that's why they are so interested in evidence-based knowledge. At least in Quebec now, all the ministries are asking for evidences. And unfortunately, for architects maybe not involved in that type of research, I will talk about that today, they will base their policies and program and funding on that. So what are the challenges in Quebec? Urban sprawl on the left, that's what GERBA, my research group, has been working since 15 years. The aging of the population, the health of youth with an important rise of chronic disease, obesity, diabetes in the less than 12 years old children. I could talk about climate change. I've been working a lot on climate change, but that's not going to be the topic today, but it's a real thing that's happening. Some presidents think it's not, but we know it is. Not only the built environment inherited from post-World War II is aging, the population also. And this aging of the population is accompanied by a low birth rate and the aging of the baby boomer. This big cohort of people who were born out of this period, 1945 to 75, and they are now, the older ones are 17 now, so they are retiring. This means an amazing increase in the aging population, 80 years old or more in 20 years. So this situation, unless there is rapid immigration, which because of the snow in Quebec, we do not seem to attract, I must say. 3 feet of snow and minus 40 in January, it's enough to discourage some immigrants. We will have the phenomenon of shrinking cities. Japan, Italy, Quebec are experiencing that now, but different parts. Sometimes it's not a country, it's specific cities that are experiencing shrinking problems because of different reasons. But you only hear about growing cities in conferences, and that really makes me shiver because this is not my home. It's not happening in my home. So think about it. So I have chosen today to illustrate 2 cases where I was asked for scientific evidence on the contribution of the built environment to the health and well-being of the young and the old. The first case concerned the housing needs of frail, older adults, very old adults, the one experiencing loss of autonomy, and I'm sure in your families you all know somebody who is in that situation now, thinking, should I stay home or should I move? So people in medical research came to me saying, we want to design a tool to help these people decide, but we don't know what's the contribution of the built environment. Could you help? The second one concerned the renovation of primary school to better support healthier lifestyle. And this mandate was given to us by the Quebec Association of School Daycare. Children now go to school holiday. They used to go home to eat at home. 1945, 75, mother at home. Remember that? My mom was at home and cooking for me every lunchtime. Now you eat at school. These buildings, 85% of the school in Quebec were designed between 1945 and 75. There's no kitchen. There's no place to eat. The kids eat anywhere. So they asked me to see how we could think about introducing guidelines and present them to the government while they remodel the building to make it better for children during the time they spend at school. Oh, you were missing that picture. Sorry about that. So what is environmental health and well-being? Sorry, I slip into French once in a while. So we talk about World Health Organization talk now about wellness. You know, it involves being able to be and feel physically safe in safe and clean surroundings, and to be able to access clean air, food, and water, and it both at the microenvironment, so your home, and at the macro environment, so your neighborhood, your city, and even the planet. And it's assumed that services should help you create living, learning, and working spaces that will promote healing, learning, contemplation, and relaxation. So for the first case on housing and in older age, as I said, we were asked to contribute on a research project by researcher in medicine. And the ultimate goal was to develop this decision aid tool for older people to make the best choice about their housing location, which for the doctors, the physician, they see it as choosing the location of care. They don't even talk about home, they talk about location of care. So the typical procedure for an older adult in Quebec is that the local center for community services will send somebody at home because the doctor said, oh, Mrs. So-and-so is losing some autonomy and might not be able to stay in her house. And they will use a standardized tool to evaluate her. And this is mainly, is she able to take care of herself and go around her house safely? And does she have support from her children or a partner to help? Few questions on economic situation. And based on that standardized tool, they will give a score that will decide if the person is recommended to move or to stay at their house. Well, of course, these doctors who came to see me have a good intuition that maybe it's not enough to understand how people relate to their home, and it's not enough to take a decision also. So we were asked to conduct a literature review and on the factor influencing housing choice in very old age, looking at scientific evidences through a systematic web search in several specialized databases. Some were cross-disciplinary also. I will not go into details about the rigor that you have to apply when you work with physicians to this process in health sciences, which goes from first identifying the good keywords, and that's a message to you, the one on which articles in each database are indexed, then excluding irrelevant studies, and after evaluating the quality of each studies kept for the review. So you see on the screen how many papers were first extracted from the databases and how many were left at the end of this procedure. So you know, you go from 761 articles, and you end up with 86 studies from 91 papers. A few studies had more than one paper out. The most common exclusion factor was that the paper simply did not deal with housing-related factors, which in itself very revealing and were very worrying also. Let us take a look at the professional training of the 210 researchers that were involved in signing or co-signing this paper. So you see that 2/3 of the paper were either signed or co-signed by human and social sciences or health sciences. I put you the dominant professional training here. 13% by economics and administration. 10% in other disciplines, 5% were trained in architecture and planning. And this was everything that had been published with screens since 1990, but published in peer-reviewed literature. If we look at the distribution of the 86 papers by number of discipline of research field involved, again, 2/3 of the papers were author or co-author from the same discipline of research field. So first, we learned that there's not many architects in there signing or co-signing. Second, that people seem to publish among themselves, in the same discipline. A third were co-authored by researcher in 2 or more research fields. I'm talking about, let's say, social work and medicine. It's a related, people are in the same research field. So overall, 11 studies involving researcher in planning, architecture, design, and 4 only associated with at least one colleague in another field. So between the discourse of transdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity and the reality, there's a huge gap. This being said, there was a lot of useful knowledge coming out of this literature review. We identify 89 factors of influence on older adult housing decision, which related to 8 categories. You see the social relation, the time, the season, the daily activities, everything that has to do with time, the health, the climate, the representation people have, their residential biography, their economic means, and the built environment. I'm putting you here only, I don't want you to read that, but these are the 25 factors that were mentioned in the literature that have directly to do with the built environment. So what's ironical is that 25% of these 89 factors of influence on the housing decision are associated with the built environment, yet only 5% of research in planning, design, or architecture, and only a few in multidisciplinary teams. This is of direct concern to planners. If we are to design housing for the elderly, for the very old, to offer alternative to the long-term care community or staying at home, somehow we should be there. The health and well-being of older adults losing autonomy depends on so many more factors than the one considered by health-related professionals. They focus mainly on care and safety. If we classify this factor according to the category of the meaning of home, what home means, which is my early work for my PhD, we realize that they're covering the whole thing. And that, again, the built environment category contains a lot of factors, but also the spatial-temporal category who are directly dependent on the physical space. It's how you use the space. So form and use is pretty much our field of expertise. So if any of you read French, this is going to, I think it's already published since a few days, but a more in-depth version will be published, is being submitted, I shouldn't say published, to a peer-reviewed journal in English. The second case, the second literature review I will talk about was completed with colleagues, with one colleague and 3 graduate students. It was part of a research contract awarded by the Quebec Association of School Daycare, as I said, and the objective was to identify what component of the built environment have been associated with the contribution to healthy behavior for children. Healthy behavior is often defined as healthy eating and physical activity. Whoops, sorry, you should see that. So again, and I'm not go as much into detail as I did before, but the data search was performed 3 years in a row, each time allowing the redefinition of the keywords and the extraction syntax. Again, out of the 826 peer-reviewed articles that were found, we were left, after exclusion factor applied, to 61 original study and 10 literature review. Only a small fraction of the 827 studies identified investigated the built environment itself. School environment was often interpreted without considering the built environment. People talk about the school environment and the built environment is not there. They talk about the social environment, but not the built. Children's behavior or pedagogy are often studied without considering the built environment. Now we're going to remodel over 2,000 school buildings in Quebec in primary school. The evidence is not taking into account the built environment. Money will be, it's $8.9 billion that the government will invest in the next 10 years. On what type of evidence will they build their program and their funding? again, if you look at the distribution of the 45 paper, 45 out of 71 were published by authors in one discipline or the same research field. Again, despite the discourse on interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity, I have so much hope for all the PhD students in the room. You're the next generation. This has to change. We have to work with other disciplines better than what we're doing now. So here, see the health discipline, 31 of the paper, education only 4. This also surprised me. Educators should be part of the picture all the time. 2 papers were signed by people trained in architecture and design, and believe me, we check everybody's CV to make sure we know where they were trained, their first professional training. You see in red, in yellow here, over the 26 research team associating more than one research field, 11 had researchers trained in architecture and design in it. At least the little researchers in our field involved in these studies are in teams that are associating multiple design fields. What are the consequences of this situation if we look for school? Despite the fact that we found, again, some useful knowledge in this evidence, and I will not go into detail, I will insist on several shortcomings that makes it difficult for the scientific evidence to inform design. Studies target almost exclusively classroom. Architects who will remodel schools in Quebec, they won't work only on the classroom. They will work on the whole building. They need to understand this whole thing. School has become more than a place of formal education. To understand this renewed vocation, eating area, children's childcare services, locker room, corridor, hallway, everything must be studied. The literature is on classroom almost exclusively, with little people in education, ironically. Description of the geographical context is lacking to interpret scientific evidence. You have studies saying, oh, this influenced so-and-so, and other ones said, no, it doesn't influence. Let's say asphalt in the courtyard or grass. Grass in Quebec with 3 meters of snow every year, in the spring is water, it's mushy. No kids will go there. So you need to understand the context to be able to interpret these data. It's just not there. Why? Because these people are not designers. They don't know we need that knowledge to work. I talk about the length and specificity of season, of course, but the sun orientation, sometimes the literature is contradictory in terms of physical ambience. Was the classroom facing south or west? Was there trees? No details. What do you want to do with that? You might be published in a peer-reviewed journal, but it doesn't mean that you're going to be useful to designers to take decision. Variables, another shortcoming is that the variables used to study the built environment are not always selected or operationalized, to use a technical term, like designer would do. Floor plans were analyzed in only 4 studies. Building construction period specified in only 3 studies. In Quebec, we have the school built under different government, and the floor plans are different, almost prototypical, so solution can be maybe prototypical. Oh, I forgot, sorry. I have a friend here telling me that you're not seeing what you should see. Metric or qualitative data describing the building types, configuration, number of stories, spatial organization, length of corridor, floor plans, ignore, not one study. Occupational density missing, ratio of pupil per square meter, normative space standard, every country has their norm. The system of education is different in every country also, so there should be detail on that. No picture of targeted school, inside or outside. And this is a problem with peer-reviewed journal. You want to put an image, they tell you, oh no, this is useless. We're talking about the built environment. Where is the built environment? So, this This literature review is, the book just came out, actually, it's in the mail, I think. So the literature review is published in English now, so for those of you who want more information or are interested by the topic. So, we're going to say, and what? So what? Can research inform design? Well, yes and no. You've seen by the two cases I presented you that yes, there is some useful knowledge, but there's so much missing. It could be so much better if there was people specialized in how to, how do we say, découper, how to cut the built environment into variables that are useful and analyzable. So these two literature reviews show that very few researchers in architecture have contributed so far to the scientific peer-reviewed knowledge bases, which are more and more used to inform public policy and program, as I told you. And that also worries me. Sorry, again. Why aren't we there? And now I'm going to speculate with you because I don't have the answer, but I just want to share my concern for this situation and see if we can interpret that and inflex the situation. Inflex in English, the situation. So for most of you involved in research, the first hypothesis is that it's hard to get published. There is the difficulty for less rigid research design. We work much more with qualitative methods to be published in some refereed journal, especially health-related. The title and keywords of architects need to be chosen more rigorously. And I keep telling my students, they have this poetic way of putting their title on their papers and using the keywords. If you want to be indexed in this journal and that your paper comes out, you have to be explicit. No time for poetry. Keep it for a conference. But you have to make it very explicit, the building type you're working, the behavior you're working, anything that will help identify these research in the searches. There is a bulk of valuable knowledge resulting from one design, and that's what we do often. And Louise presented so many beautiful participatory process. I do a lot. I know several of you are presented in the last 2 days on that. It's site-specific. It's project-specific. It is hard to publish. Although process and lesson from these projects are transferable to other similar contexts, and Louise has been very successful in publishing a project. So if you want to publish, you have to think about the process, what you've learned through the process, and not that much about the specific design. The other problem we have is that the implemented projects, the ones that get built, are often presented as best practices. And I use best practices, but I'm getting a bit careful about them. Because they are often published on web, most likely, or books, with little knowledge on the geographic, political, cultural context, and without performance assessment. Is it working? And this has to be, it's not that we should not do it, the contrary, but if we want these case studies to be publishable, we have to make sure we put the context around them. So people in another country will say, okay, school, oh, in Finland, it's first grade to grade 9. In Quebec, it's 1 to 6. So it doesn't work the same way. Kids are much older. And you start understanding how the build form works differently. I don't know if I make myself clear, but that's, anyway, that's one of my hypotheses. The other hypothesis is that, despite, again, the talk on the new ways of conducting research, it is still hard to break disciplinary silos. There is a lack of understanding from colleagues in other fields of research, and I have experienced that, not that much with social sciences, with whom we have a long tradition of collaboration in architecture, environmental psychology, cultural geography. But when you get to health, architect as researcher are unknown. We're just another stakeholder. And I was talking to my 18-year-old son, because I gave a lecture in a college to people of his age, and I wanted to know what they knew about architecture. He said, Mom, nobody has the slightest idea what an architect can do in terms of research. You do building. So when people ask us to stand on research team, they expect us to be there as a provider of a professional expertise, but not as researcher. We have to get ourselves known as researcher. Architecture is a discipline, as I showed earlier in one of my slides. It's not just a professional service. And we're partly guilty about that, because there's like something in architecture that you're shy to say you do research. It's not cool, because it means you're a bad designer. Forget it. It has nothing to do with that. We need so much to respect each other. Researcher, in faculty staff, work together. It's time to, if we're not able to break the silos within our own discipline, how can we expect to break the silos with other disciplines? The other problem, I think, might be the concentration of money in health research. Gee, you wouldn't believe the discrepancy between the budget of my colleague in health and my budget in research, multiplied by 10. So, of course, they are able to move quicker than we are because we have so little money. So, again, it might be time to state loud and clear, like Jan Giel has been doing for so many years, that the environment makes a difference in people's life, and it has to be of concern to decision makers. And my last point is, again, I say that we should bear some of the responsibility for not being there. Our students are quite illiterate. Our graduate students, professional graduate students, are quite illiterate in terms of research. Illiterate meaning they don't know how to read research. And of course, it's so hard when you teach architecture. There's so many things they have to know. It's so complex, the design process. But I think we ought to think about giving basic training at the undergraduate level. How many of our students know about statistics? When you know statistics, basic statistics, not necessarily conducting them, but interpreting them, you're able to say, this is bullshit, this piece of paper, because it's not true. But architects, they go and read the conclusion or the introduction, and they think it's true. That's why these literature reviews are so important, because they tell you, no, we analyze the quality of each paper based on standards, and you can tell if it's a valuable research or not. There is also, I think it's rare that we see people in the professional master's degree having training in research translation. And I'm not saying everybody should do it, but they should be aware that this is a legitimate way of doing a career in research. This means being able to identify, read, translate scientific evidence for a designer, for design criteria. As I showed you, you need to have somebody who understands the design process to be able to turn these data into something usable. A lot of the time I read that and I'm like, what can I do with that? I'm doing a concrete project on the side and I'm like, there's no way I can use this information. I'm lacking too much information. And we have to push some students to pursue post-professional degree in areas of research that are marketable. I'm saying marketable because there's a lot of research, and I'm not criticizing research in theory and philosophy in architecture because it's very important also. There's different type of knowledge that feeds the design process, and I have a lot of respect for other types of knowledge. But a lot of students come to me when I give my courses on the human aspect of urban form, and they say, this is what I want to do in my career, make better environment. I don't want to sign a building. So let these people, these graduates who want to do different, be different. And let's stop cloning architects so they're all the same. You know, at my university, you talk about having 2 students do a final thesis, and people are like, oh, no, they should work alone. Nobody works alone anymore. Problems are complex. We have to teach them how to work together. A mission, maybe, for some of us. I challenge us as university professors. How many here are professors in the School of Architecture? That's what I expected, the great majority. How many are aspiring to be professor in the School of Architecture doing their PhD? Okay, that's pretty much the other. So we're all in the same boat. So I challenge us to act as advocates, to revise the curricula of architects and designers, so to provide everybody with a basic literacy skill in research. More advanced training for several of them to become research translators, and some of them to contribute to original knowledge production. And I know that a few people among you are also reflecting about the architectural curricula. I know that there was some people, I won't name them, but I have a list here that I made, and I know a lot of you are interested in that. So you should dare. A way to do it is to do like I did for 10 years, is to be the director of graduate programs. It gives you a little political power to inflect things, and don't laugh. It's an important, the political power you have to implement change. So introduce changes in the architectural curricula with regard to research and studio teaching. Support also diversity in faculty hiring. In Quebec now, no way. You have to be architect to teach in the School of Architecture. Is it the case? Raise your hand if it's the case in your university. Okay, so it means there's some hope in other countries. It means you can be a sociologist, you can be an art historian, maybe. Do you have environmental psychologists in your schools? Sociologists? A few there. Not much when you realize, when you go around the block. Promote architecture and design as research, and make sure your voice are heard through the financing agency. In Quebec, I'm on a mission now. When you apply for a grant, you look for architecture and research, you're not there. You're in arts and humanities. So you end up on a jury that does not believe in research, and they push you aside. So this is the system we have to fight also. So I'm being pragmatic here, but these are avenues. And you know, they will listen. If you take the phone and you go up and up and up and you end up at the top, well, they say, oh, never heard of that. Nobody ever told me. So speak up. And provoke the occasion to present your research to colleagues and students from other research fields. Look on the web, find a professor in medical school or a nurse teaching things or in education and offer to give a lecture. And they will say yes. Who professor does not accept to have a guest and take a break for one lecture once in a while? So you might be well served by that. So I will finish with food for thought. The next generation of designers can play, I believe, an active role in helping meet urgent and complex environmental, social, and economic challenges. If we don't teach them to produce appropriate or interpret or use scientific research, I think they might miss the boat, and I explain myself. The momentum we are living now of rebuilding the infrastructure from the baby boom is not going to come back before another 50, 60 years. So if we don't do it better now, we miss the boat. So maybe we're ready for a change. And this is a studio from undated, so I don't know, and it's a studio now. So it looks pretty much the same. Go and see the laboratory of Louis Pasteur and the laboratory now. You're going to see something that's so different. So maybe it's time for a change. Gracias. Gracias. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I think that this is a special speech for the students of the School of Architecture that are in the first level. If you go there, you read the papers now, and you see that they are completely agreeing with her, even though nobody cares about that. Nobody hears them. Okay, now the second speaker is a very known architect from Denmark that arrived to impact a lot of designers for a lot of countries. I confess that through my students of PhD students, they have been the best way to know his work, because they are enthusiastic with a lot of publications and works. And then I discovered that I know him from the 72 International Conference on Psychology in Kingston, that I was there with him without knowing that it was the same person. And then I read the first article about environmental psychology, and I have proof that the continuity and the one successful view from social science, architecture, and design. Just the thing we are talking about. I invite him several times, and always he answered me has a doctoral honorarium degree at the same days of the June. That was true. Yeah, he said, no, I am in Canada again, and in Canada again, because he has so many honorarium PhD things that is full occupied. Then this year I said, I suppose that this time you have not, no. And they say, okay, not this time, perhaps next month or in 2 months, he will have an honorary degree in another university. I think that this this dimension of research of the architect, it seems easy, but it's not easy. It's a very subtle problem. And I know a lot of architects. I use to talk about the prestigious Catalan architects like Enric Miralles, etc. That I can dialogue with them, but they don't know absolutely why they are doing what they are doing. They don't know absolutely not. They do very good architecture, but they don't know why. Then I talk to them and then try to push them in the direction that Carol says. No? Perhaps you can explain why you are doing these things. No? Well, this is very dangerous. They are afraid. No? They explain to me why they're, but they don't want I explain to others. No? They explain to me, yeah, I do that. Okay, then I can write about that. Well, be careful, because I am not interested you explain too much. And it's a very subtle thing. It's not just that they are not interested in research. It's because by tradition and by the social, just you explain, no? This confusion to say, well, if an architect explain why they are doing the thing, that is a bad architect. But when he doesn't explain, it's some kind of genial architect. This has been a tradition again and again in a lot of countries' generation, and now it's beginning to change. No? And you can think that this reaction and confrontation between the school of architecture between professors and students now is very important. It's a change. Now you can talk with the students in the School of Barcelona, very young students, and they have completely different attitude in relation to that. Now they don't feel that they should be builders. No, they want to be another thing. They say the architect can be a builder, but also can be a researcher, also can be social counseling, and they are not making classification that the good is the builder. No, but this is a very difficult change for students of architecture. It's not easy. And the nice thing is nobody helped them to do that. When I go to these students, they say, no, don't explain anything to us. We don't want the professors helping us. No, we know very clear what we are doing. No, that there is a change in the profession, there is a change in the way the society needs architects. Now the society and the users in general, the human being, mother, they are asking for different kinds of architects. And they feel that now is time. In this sense, we're saying that the hope is that this can evaluate. Then, Jan-Gel has made extraordinary work during the last 50 years, and I think that is an excellent possibility of connect architecture and research through his work. Thank you, Jan, for coming.
Works? Yes, it works. Carol, I think it was a very, very interesting story you had to tell. And I had, all the time I was thinking about all my own experiences and my work through all these years, to have my fellow architects understand that research could be meaningful. And I remember all these discussions that architecture is not a profession because they never get more clever. They just take 2 pictures of the building and rush to the next one, never go back to see what works and what did not work. As opposed to doctors who give 10 pills to this group and 10 pills to that group, then they count how many died in that group and say, oh, that pill was better. They get more clever. And we have this connection with the art. An artist doesn't have to make research. An artist doesn't have to study, go back to the work. But not so with architecture. It is art, but it's also the frame of people's life. So that's why it's so important that research is part of it. And I could recognize many of the things. I am, as a researcher in architecture, I'm absolutely an autodidact. I never learned a thing about how to do it. And throughout my 40 years in School of Architecture, my colleagues always thought I was wasting my time, that I should start to do something more meaningful, because all this with people, whatever, was of course not architecture, and I could never be a professor because all these people, you know, stuff, that was not what made architecture. I was professor when I was 67, 3 years before I retired, and that was not because my colleagues in School of Architecture thought that would be meaningful. That was because a very rich foundation in Denmark gave a big sum to the city, to the university, saying, actually it was not even a university, it was an Academy of Fine Arts. That's worse than a university. And they're more sort of art for art's sake. But they got a big sum for these guys if they will create a research unit in my area and put me in charge of it. Oh yes, sir, yes, please give us the money. So it was made. I could recognize many of things, and now I shall tell you, I hope we can do it inside the time frame which has been given to this. Okay, I'm going to tell you about 50 years from Jane Jacobs wrote her book until the ideas which she started to plant the seeds for these ideas, they are now universally used. Took 50 years. I'll tell you that story. First, I'll tell you about the two old planning paradigms, which has been a great problem throughout the second half of the 20th century. One was the modernism. I state 1960 as a very important year because that was a time when really building took off, when all the cities had to expand, when we really had to speed up with the rebuilding after the Second World War. And at that point, they had these old philosophies from the 30s and 20s of modernism, of Corbusier, and they were brave new world, and they were practical. They could be done quickly. They could be automatized and mechanized and factory produced. And all these ideas that cities were bad and freestanding buildings were good, that public space was bad but grass was good. All these ideas were taken over and sort of broke through and was used in a very big way from 1960 onwards. Part of the philosophy of the modernists was that they defined that everything related to the old man was redundant and really could not be used, because now we have the modern man, that's the right guy rushing around down there, and everything had to be new architecture, new interiors, new site plans, and new city planning. Everything had to be new, and everything old had to be discarded. It was useless. It was for the old man. Come on now. Here we are. For me, one of the most serious or most dramatic changes between the old days and the modernistic days was that the old days we always built spaces, and then we organized our functions, our buildings around spaces. This is a square in Venice, and this was how all the old cities was made. But then, come on now, where shall I point it? Now, with the modernists, it was something else. Instead of spaces, they have leftover spaces. Instead of spaces, public spaces, they started to have no man's land. This is a beautiful plan of Corbusier for saving Paris by tearing it all down and building 24 high-rise buildings where the people in Paris could sit up there and look out over wonderful Paris. And as you can see, it's all no man's land with roads for cars in between. It was at that point as if the planners who used to work down where people were, they went up in aeroplanes and started to put down their various compositions. I was in school in the 50s, and we spent much time in organizing objects from a big height, and this is a fine city. And also in this shift from before to modernism, before then the spaces were in focus, but after that the buildings were in focus. So the whole energy was shifted from the spaces to the buildings, to the individual buildings. And here the compositions are put down here, and down where people were, there was nobody interested in this. There was no profession looking after this. The planners were not looking after this. The architects were looking after the buildings, and the landscape architects were down on their knees looking after greenery and biology, but they knew nothing about people either. There was not a single. I've been traveling all over the place and looked if they taught about people in any planning school, architecture school, or landscape architecture school, and I can say for sure I never found a program which gave you a systematic knowledge about the people who were to use the places. So, completely neglected. Here we are. I call it the Brasilia syndrome. Brasilia, the new capital of Brazil, 1955, very tooted, very famous thing. When I was studying in the 50s, every morning we bent towards Brasilia, and we thought that was the greatest thing man has ever produced. And Brasilia, of course, is a fantastic thing. It's from the airplane. It's an eagle. The head of the eagle is the parliament, and the beautiful monuments or buildings by Niemeyer. The ministers are lying, and there are big lawns and whatever. So from the aeroplane and the helicopter, Brasilia is fantastic. Down at eye level, Brasilia is shit. Could somebody do some manual work over there? Then I clap my hands. That means change. Okay, next one. No, at eye level, Brasilia is completely impossible. And it's all planned from an aeroplane, and it works brilliantly. They never had money to give all the Brazilians a helicopter each so they can enjoy their city. So they trample up and down these endless roads and do all these illegal routes through the parks, because that's what man would like to do, to go the direct way. That means change. Here, a dream is becoming reality. I found this in Toronto in 1972. It's about a suburb in Toronto being built, and the dream is here. And as you can see, the message was simple: build it for the people. It is completely no man's land, and all the energy is on the objects, on the single buildings, and there's not 1 meter you would like to be in the whole area here. It's a shopping center, 5,000 parking lots, corporate headquarters, and then the poor people are living in the high-rise around if they can find room for the freeways. The dream has become reality. Modernism. And today, looking back at that period, I think that if any time in history a bunch of planners and professionals have been asked to make something which was completely impossible for people, they could not have been better than was the modernists. I'm a little bit critical of their work. The other big paradigm which has been very, very influential in the second half of the 20th century has been the car invasion. Again, I say that there was nothing much problem before around 1960, when really the cheap cars started to roll into our societies, and gradually we saw this development. We have the first stage, no problem at all. This is Main Square, Copenhagen, with the Royal Theatre. People are walking freely all over the place. It's the city of the people. There's one car and one tram, no problem. One horse, maybe also a bicycle, no problem. Next stage, more cars. Now it's about running for your life to save who can save himself and his children, and then people are pushed off the spaces. And the third stage is Moscow, where the cars have completely taken over everything, and there's no room at all for people. This is a pedestrian crossing where you can train slalom. So these two planning paradigms has had an enormous influence on the thinking and on anything we have been doing for the past 50 years. Then, if we go back to 1960, what was known about quality for people at that time? That was actually, we knew nothing, because everything of the old cities was informal knowledge. It was traditions handed over from one generation. They knew exactly how to make nice cities for people in Venice and in all the medieval cities. But all this old stuff has been discarded by the modernists. Nothing could be used. Nothing was written down, so we knew nothing. And then we, of course, something we knew, and this is Enrique Peñalosa, who said that we know much more about a good habitat for mountain gorillas than we know about a good urban habitat for Homo sapiens. And he is absolutely right. Think about all the programs in the television where we see tigers and the love life of the elephants and all that stuff, but never something about behavior of Homo sapiens in his built environment. Then, of course, there started to be a big voice raising from Manhattan. I will take for granted that you all know about Jane Jacobs and her fight against Robert Moses and her book, which has forever since been very, very influential. But basically what she yelled in Manhattan in 1961 was that if the modernists and the motorists are to plan our cities, it will be dead cities and end of great cities. And she also said, for God's sake, don't sit in your offices and think about how things might be. Look out of the window and see how they are, see how the streets work, and be inspired by real life in what you're doing, and don't do all these moon bases, whatever they did. 1961. My own career, you will have a very short version here. I graduated in 1960, and I was taught all this about hanging over the models and pushing the objects around. This one was one of our great heroes of that time, a Swedish professor who explained that a good housing area is something which looks good from the freeway. They were great times. I rushed out of university to do all these fantastic things I've just learned about modernism and motorism. And then I married a psychologist. And now, looking back, I can see that the 60s was an interesting time where these silos started to be breaking up. And then here I was with my young architect friends, with my wife and her psychologist friends, and suddenly there was a window into the social sciences. And these social scientists, they had once started to say, why are you architects not interested in people? Us, we are very interested in people. That is not visible at all. And also, why don't they teach you anything about people in School of Architecture? Why do you think your professors go out at 4 o'clock in the morning to take their photos of architectural objects so there are no people in the foreground to distract you during your lectures? These young psychologists, they were very much to the point, and we had a bad time. We started to say aesthetics, and they say, oh, it's so much of everything, all the rest you don't know. That was the beginning. What, in my personal case, I had to go back to School of Architecture for 40 more years to learn what they didn't teach me in the first round. It appeared that they didn't know anything there at all, so I had to more or less, with my autodidactic curiosity, to find out how to study this. And really, what I worked on for many, many years was to make the people who use our buildings and use our cities visible for the planners, for the politicians, for the people themselves, by studying behavior and studying how things were used. After a little while, there was one book, and then there was another book, and then there were more books. And actually, I have been studying for 50 years by now. Then, after a while, also there came, of course, writing books about making better cities for people. I was invited to give a lot of lectures, and at these lectures, there would gradually come more and more mayors and say, you can criticize, but can't you come and show us what we shall do? And then I realized, as academic, you can criticize. You are pretty free. You can say everything. You have a return ticket, no problem. but really trying to address the problems in the real life, that's another story than being an academic. In year 2000, we started a company, and then we have been extremely busy by addressing improving cities in all parts of the world. Much to my surprise, I found that my humble little book started to be spread all over the place. Especially, I'm very happy to see them being used in a number of developing countries to make a more humanized environment. I like especially the Spanish version of, actually it was my PhD, and it is from 1971, but this is a later version. But in Spanish it's called La Humanización del Espacio Urbano. I think that's a better title than Life Between Buildings. And I like the idea that this kind of thinking is being used now in quite a few number of developing countries. I'm, of course, very, very proud that all my books are published in China. They were some of the first to publish them, and they publish everything. And I know they're widespread because I've signed most of them. It took a long time. And what makes me in my old days very worried is that they have not had time to read them yet. But maybe after some more time. Then I got out of architecture school. Actually, I was thrown out because I was too old. But this foundation, which was so happy about studies in what we call the human dimension in architecture and planning, they came again and said, Jan, we would like you to sit down and write down everything you know while you can still remember it. And then they said, I said, I'm rather busy, but isn't that a matter of how much money we give you to assistants and whatever? And suddenly I had time and we got it written. And in just 7 years now, it's out in 35 languages, including many funny languages like Spanish, like Arabic, like Thai, like Russian, and it's even out in French. And do you think it was published in Paris? No, it was published in Quebec. Of course, they are much more up to the forefront over there, as you could hear from Carol. But yes, even in German it's come out. It took 40 years, but now they are selling them like hotcakes. And how are they spread so widely? Yeah, I have found, and I can give all you academics a good idea here. I give the books away for free. I say, I was paid for the university or the foundation to write these books, and if you can use it in Albania or in Macedonia or in Bulgaria or in Kazakhstan, you are free to use it, because I'm interested. I did this for mankind. I'm interested in these ideas being spread out. And if it's more easy for you to publish without a royalty, do it. That is a very good formula. Now you know that. Of course, not to the Americans, they have to pay. Then, after having worked with all this ideology and all this theory, we started this company in 2000, and at once it grew fantastically, very, very fast. And again, like this book, which was in just 7 years distributed all over the world, and I don't see this as something that this is very important stuff in the book, but I see that there's a very big hunger around the world for knowledge about how to make better cities for people. And that's why there's not much written. So when something is written, it's very, very easy to see it spread. And the same with our company. We started to say, do you want livable cities, sustainable cities, healthy cities? We can help you. And then the phone started ringing, and we have been running flat out. Now there are 70 people in offices in San Francisco, New York, and Copenhagen, and working from one end of the city, of the world, to the other. Again, it's because there is an enormous interest in this kind of qualities in the cities. So now we are 2017, and I would say that now we know quite a few things, even if Peñalosa think we know more about the mountain gorillas. There has been now 50 years of studies. Of course, I can see that there are not that many people who have studied these particular things about the relation between form and life. But there are quite a few, and some of them are here, so we know quite a bit. And some of the things we know quite a bit about city planning. And of course, what we did before the modernists, we assembled, we integrated, we invited, opened up, and we made good quality spaces. And then came the modernists. They dispersed, they segregated, they made spaces you didn't want to, they closed things in, and they made no spaces. And then they got this. So we know quite a bit about city planning, and we also know of the enormous influence of city planning on the quality of people's life. First we shape the cities, but then by golly, the cities shape you. But maybe the most important things we came to realize by all these studies was that, okay, planning things, the bigger planning decisions were important, but what was really important was the small scale, was where people were, and that was exactly where the modernists had overlooked it the most. And we could go to a place like the Campo in Siena and find that it works fantastically, even if it's been there for 700 years. And then you can think, is this a miracle, or could it be common sense? Then we have made, over the years, a number of keywords, of things you should look after, and that I'm not going to tell you more about. It's also to be found in this one, which is in Spanish. But there's something about you should be protected against a number of bad things. Then you should find a great comfort and care and invitation for some of the things you like to do. And then there are some enjoyment. It should be in human scale. You should be able to enjoy the good parts of the climate. And finally, positive sense experiences, aesthetics, art, plants, water, views, all that, which many architecture schools concentrate on this box, but only if all the boxes are looked after do you actually have a very good people environment. Going back to Siena, not only can you say to all these 12, yes, But you can say, yeah, wow, oi. And when you come down to the aesthetic quality, to the design and to the materials, you can say fantastic. Plus all the other things. That's why it's world famous. You can go to the main square in Brasilia and find that none of these 12 things have been at all looked into. And furthermore, and I'm more and more obsessed by this or interested in this, there's no space. I really think that you need a defined space really before you can dance properly in a public space. And here there is just a plain, no space. This is a beautiful central city square in a small Australian city in West Australia. And they came to me and said, come and look at our city square. Why doesn't it work? And I said, where are the edges? No square can work without edges. You need a defined space where you really feel human scale, comfortable definition. This is just free-floating something in the air. Will never work. After 50 years, we now have a distinct change of paradigms. I would say that the modernism, and to some extent the motorism, is on its way out. Actually, I haven't got time today to show you this, but automobile driving in the world peaked 6 years ago. In America, they are back to the level of driving 20 years ago. Trump will not like that, but that's the case. In all Australian cities, car driving is going down. So I think that increasingly we're finding out that the technology of individual mobility, which was invented in the Wild West in Detroit in 1905, this 120-year-old technology that everybody could get for rubber wheels, and that will make everybody happy and mobile, that doesn't work in cities. And the bigger the cities are, the less it works. It's on its way out. And we will have a new situation coming. Today, if you ask any mayor I know, what is your program? He will say, I want a livable, sustainable and healthy city. The livability is something which is very old. That's about quality of life, and that is about man as a social animal, that the greatest attraction in cities are your fellow citizens, and the public spaces where you can meet eye to eye is still very, very attractive, and every time we make good spaces, people come to them happily. A new driver is that we shall make sustainable cities. The more we walk and bicycle, the better for the climate, but also we will have to rely much more on public transportation in the future to get around in the still bigger cities. And of course, we can make the public transportation much more climate friendly and sustainable. And then you need good public realm so that these two will work together in fantastic neighborhoods and cities. And then we have a new problem which had popped up. My daughter is a doctor, and she has a number of doctor friends, and they discuss increasingly the sitting syndrome, that we have made city planning for 50 years, which did everything to have people sit all the day. And there were all the time some theories that everybody will be so clever as to go 3 times a week to the fitness center and sit in a rowing machine. And that has turned out that only 25% ever go near those places. And all the rest just get fatter and fatter. And then they know, on the other hand, that 1 hour of moderate exercise every day will give you 7 extra years of life and a much better quality of life in the old days, and a much, much cheaper health system. So, World Health Organization today say to all of us, make your cities so that people walk and bike as much as possible. and that personal movement is part of the daily curriculum for every citizen. Don't expect them to go to fitness classes, all of them, throughout life. They don't. So we have a rule now that we shall make things so that people move rather than sit. And if we look closer at all these demands and we look closer at this people-oriented planning, you get a more lively, more livable, more sustainable and more healthy city. Actually, all these issues are addressed if you make more people-oriented planning. What can we do now? My conclusion really is that we can certainly improve qualities, but mostly in existing cities. I will invite you to a few places, and I know we have very little time, but I'll fly over them very quickly. But are there places where they have this idea, we will do everything to invite people to walk and bicycle? Yes, one city is Copenhagen, where I come from, 1.5 million. They have worked on these issues for 55 years. They started in 62, and nobody believed you could ever take the cars away from the Danes. No way. And the climate was so we could never use the public spaces, and we were Danes, we were not Italians. Then they pushed the cars out anyway. Next year we started to be Italians, and we have become more and more Italian for every year for 50 years now. It was very, very early. It was the same year almost when Jane Jacobs wrote in Manhattan. But actually in Manhattan, the only thing which happened was that nothing happened. The Trans-Manhattan Freeway was not put in. In Denmark, something happened. They started to push out the cars from center of a number of cities at that early time. Copenhagen also was the first city in the world where the people using the city were systematically studied and documented. And that was what we did at the Royal Academy. And we used Copenhagen. I had a research grant to study how people use spaces, public spaces in cities and residential areas. And they just made this pedestrian area in Copenhagen. So we went there and studied it. And we continued to study it. We studied it for 40 years and got a lot of information. And this documentation had enormous influence on the policy of the city because the politicians picked it up, the planners picked it up. Denmark is small. If something happened in university, everybody knows next day. And when I retired from university, I got this nice letter from the mayor saying that if you guys in university had not given us all this documentation about the people, the conditions for people in Copenhagen, we politicians would never have dared to make Copenhagen the most livable city in the world. So they use this very much in their discussion with businessmen and with stakeholders, saying that actually we have proof here that it works. There are more people, they're more happy, they buy more. This is Copenhagen 1962. This is Copenhagen. This is the areas which are addressed by now in various ways. They've had every year little bit of improvement in all the years. Looking into this, I can see, and that is parallel to developments in society. The first phase was just to make room for people so they could walk. And that was a crisis because the businessmen could see that there were not so many people on the streets anymore. They were pushed out. So the first phase, maybe the first 20 years, was mostly about making room for walking. Then the next 20 years, it was not enough to walk. Now you must also sit. There was a time when the tourism started. There was a time when people started to travel and came back and say, oh, I saw nice things in Venice and Firenze, and I would like to have cappuccino here. And then it was, the cappuccino culture was spreading, and that was a time when all the squares were cleared of parking and all the cultural events started to happen, because if you have many nice spaces in a city, then you start also to see people get good ideas. I can have a ballet festival here, we can have the jazz festival here, we can have a gay parade here, we can have a poetry something here. So that was when people started to sit for recreation, that the major recreation in the city was going into the city and having a good time. Early on, it was going out in the woods to get away from the city. And then the third phase are the phase now where more and more emphasis are on spaces which invite people for various types of activity. Of course, all these spaces are now there for use. Copenhagen now is on the next step, which is where did that go? It's here, sorry. No, Copenhagen in 2009 did an official strategy, will be the best city for people in the world, and they have very specific things they want to achieve, and the major reason for this policy, that is something about it's good for your health, it's good for the climate, but first and foremost it's good for the city, and it's good for social inclusion, it's good for democracy, that people get out of their privacy and join the other people in the public spaces, in the squares, in the parks, and participate. And this policy is something about making people be more outside of their private enterprise. Some signs of this is that all Copenhagen streets used to look like this. Now they all look like this. Only 2 lanes, median, bicycle lanes, street trees, and this street is much more beautiful, much more safe, and it can take just the same number of cars as this street can, because the traffic engineers now, they are much smarter than they were 20 years ago. And this is one of my favorites. Whenever there is a small street going out to a big street, they narrow the small street. They have room for a bench and a tree. They take the sidewalk across, take the bicycle lane across. And I thought that was great. But then I talked to my daughter and she said, "Oh, it's so fantastic, Papa. Would you imagine?" Laura, my granddaughter, 7, she can now walk to school all the way because she can stay on the sidewalk from her door to school door. She doesn't have to pass any streets anymore. And that's for a 7-year-old all the difference if you have to pass streets or if Mercedes-Benz cars have to pass sidewalks. That's another story. So that's part of this policy which I think has made Copenhagen very nice. Also, we found in Copenhagen that the better they made the public spaces, the more public life we have. Actually, there has been developing a fantastic culture of using public space because we have the public spaces now all over the space, all over the city. What do we know also about this is that if you do lousy invitations, they don't work. This is a study of a square, and in this square, out of the 12 quality criteria, they've overlooked 13. And here people run as fast as they can to get out of the square. Here's the same square, another square, where they remembered all the 12. And here is always 10 times more activity than on the other. So these details mean a lot. We have no time today, so I'll skip through the bicycling. They've done a lot for bicycling. They really, they made a complete citywide bicycling system, and it's become into a transportation system. Every third family in Copenhagen, including my daughter, she has a cargo bike. The crucial thing in a bicycle system is the crossings. They have made the crossings now very carefully. They are very safe. And my grandchildren, when they are 10, they can be allowed to bike all over the city by themselves because that's safe. You can take, of course, the bike for free in the train and in the metro. And that's become a bicycle culture. Everybody bicycles, the businessmen and the children, the pregnant mothers, the crown prince hasn't got much time, but the crown princess has got more time. The government bicycles. And do we have problems? Yes, we have. As they have invited more bicycling, make good infrastructure, more and more people have found it smart to bike because that's cheaper and good for your health, and you get there quicker. And now we have had this awful complaint that the congestion on bicycle lanes, but now they have doubled all the bicycle lanes, and where do they get the room for? They took another lane from the cars because there can be 5 times more people on a bicycle lane than there can be in a car lane. So it's very good transport economy if you have enough bikes to take some more asphalt. And that also keeps the traffic down, which is all very good. Now, again, we have learned that if you really are serious about the bicycles, you can have a fantastic increase. Copenhagen now, 45% of everybody bike to work every day. In the summer. In the winter it's slightly lower, but and also we have known from other cities that if you are half-hearted, you don't get this effect because it's only for the brave and the few if you do all these compromises. You really have to make it safe so that your child could bike from one end to the other. That is not what they can do in these other places. Are there other cities who have similar programs? Yes, there are. No time for that. But I could mention Melbourne, where we have worked with Melbourne now for almost 30 years on a very parallel program to Copenhagen. Melbourne now is by far the best city in the Southern Hemisphere. They have a policy in Melbourne, we walk, and if we are to walk, we shall have trees for shade, we shall have wide sidewalks, we shall have the best street furniture program in the world. They have so many fine things about Melbourne now that it's just like Paris, but the weather is much better. And if I give you quick advice, if you don't know what to do, move to Melbourne. I could also tell you quite a bit about Sydney. Of course, we worked with Melbourne for many years, and then when it was more or less not remembered that we had worked for Melbourne, the Sydney came and said, could you Melbourneize us? Because they are all the time competing, and Sydney is very famous for something, but certainly their city center is not worth writing many postcards about. And there was made a very big plan about, one of them was to take all this awful traffic out of the narrow main street and put in a light rail and bicycles and pedestrians. It was very hard to get the buses out for various reasons, but now they are full speed. They've closed Main Street, they're full speed introducing the light rail, and it shall be open next year. It's very interesting that in the list of most livable cities in the world are exactly those cities who have done most for the people in the city. And you can see they're mostly from Scandinavia and from Australia and New Zealand. Where's Barcelona? Huh. New York, in 2007, the mayor of New York promised the world, I'll make the most sustainable metropole in the world. And he went, and his planners went to Copenhagen, and they were very excited, and they say, we want a city like this one. When can you come? And I said, Monday. And then we went to New York and was consultant for New York. And being Americans, they started right away. They have put in now 800 kilometers of good bicycle lanes. And they've done everything to promote bicycling. The mayor said, I have a flat city, a compact city, wide streets. It's ideal for bicycling. I have the best metro in the world. you take the bike or you take my metro, but you don't take your bloody car into my city center. They had 1 million of commuter cars in Manhattan every day. Then they started to think that we haven't really got any public spaces, and then we started to investigate maybe you don't need Broadway. And then you found out traffic can do without Broadway. And then in 2009, it was decided to close Broadway in a number of key spots, one of them being Times Square, and this is spring 2009. This is later 2009, and all the taxi drivers, they were yelling, "Oh, they are ruining the New York." And the mayor said, "Don't worry, it's only an experiment." Half a year later, he came out and said, "Experiment? No way. It's the biggest success we've had in newer American city planning." Now they go on, this is New Yorker, that maybe we could go on with the recreation theme. And Jane Jacobs is jiggling in her heaven because after 50 years, her ideas have finally come back to New York. Now they have made 50 squares like Times Square for people. All the squares they've taken from the cars, they've taken the asphalt from the cars and giving it to the people, and it's all over the city. Then I heard from Carol that we spoke at the same conference in Montreal in 2011, and then after my talk about these things in New York and whatever, this little man came galloping up to me and said, "I'm the deputy mayor from Moscow. Can you come and help us in Moscow to humanize Moscow? You can have 12 months. And I said, "Yeah, we can come on Monday." So we went to Moscow and we were absolutely shocked because Moscow was completely invaded by motor cars. Because I think that freedom from communism is the right to park everywhere, pay nothing. That's freedom, true freedom. But this is a nice little residential street. Have a good time in Moscow. And this is Main Street, Moscow. Of course, they had not enough parking, so they parked on the sidewalk on Main Street, Moscow, and there was 1 meter left in this city of 15 million people. There were 1 meter left for walking on the Main Street. Not so impressive. Then they said, "Hey, Jan, how many books have you written? We'll translate them all." And then they grabbed some of them, and 3 months later they were published by the city of Moscow. Here are the guys standing with the books, and the worried guy is the Danish ambassador. And then we were commissioned to study and come up with suggestions for how to improve the situation for people in Moscow, which has deteriorated very badly. During this process, I was invited to the big man, the mayor, and he said, "What would be in your report?" Yes, I will mention this idea of parking on the sidewalk on Main Street, Moscow, because no other city, no other metropolitan city in the world will do such a thing. So that will be mentioned that that's not a good idea. Then 2 months later, I came back, no cars on the sidewalk, because they have very efficient democracy. And that was way before our report has been published. The cars were gone. And then if you forget about it, mayor has a little car which goes around and pick up your car and take it to an unknown place, maybe Siberia. But then you don't know if you will ever see it again. But very efficient democracy. But what happened in New York was the biggest miracle I've ever seen anywhere. A year and a half later, we can come back and see that instead of parked cars, there were benches all the way the gray street was beginning to be green. Instead of the signs, advertisements, now you could see Kremlin at the end of the street. And there was a big, and this has continued. They have actually cleaned up the street, the cities so much. They have also introduced a parking system, not very popular because they have to pay, and they can't park everywhere. They have taken the cars out of the pedestrian crossings, and they've started with a bicycle system, and they really have cleaned up after the car invasion very quickly. So now a street in Moscow may look like this. And now we are going to come to the end. It's not quite the end, though, but we are shortly there. Now the mayor of Moscow goes around to cities all over that region and say the important thing is to have a livable city. And I think that if the mayor of Moscow goes around saying these things, then we really can conclude that the ideas of Jane Jacobs of 1960 has now become worldwide used. Here, the mayor of Lithuania, Vilnius, is telling people not to park in his bike lanes, and Jane Jacobs is jiggling up in her heaven, think that's exactly what she would have done in that case. Even in Singapore, where they have 32 degrees all the time, and very humid climate, we have been asked to come and help them to introduce a bicycle system. They are not going to commute with bicycle, but they pedal 2 kilometers down to the train. They have room for no more cars. And Singapore may be the first city in the world which will be without cars. They haven't got the room for it on their little island. So many say, this is Bucharest in Romania, and it's a little messy, but they've just got my book, so very soon they will have sorted this out, I'm quite sure. Here we could stop and clap our hands and say, gee, fantastic, welcome to the 21st century, now everything is sort of on the right track. Jane Jacobs and her ideas and her followers are really being heard. I could stop here, but I will not. A very quick tour. Where do we not use the teaching of Jane Jacobs and her followers? That is, we use these things in cleaning up in the existing cities after the cars, but I'm so deeply worried of the crap which is still going on in the new construction. It is as if the developers and the architects and the planners and politicians have not found out that we know a lot about people-friendly environments. They are still doing this, sitting with the models and putting it down and say, this must be a good city because it looks good. They are still doing things like this. This is a clear modernism, Dubai. And we are still having the bird-shit architects which fly all over the world and drop their silly towers whenever there's somebody who will pay them, just like prostitutes. But you don't get a good city by dropping towers, for God's sake. And they don't get a good city by this. So going to Dubai, where you really can see modernism and motorism, you could ask, is this really what we can do for mankind in 2017? Going to the suburbs of Moscow, we can say again, is this really what you can do for mankind in 2017? And again, as I mentioned, it was always the details which was the biggest problem. This is from London. Is this really what you would like to experience in London? Is this something which Rem Koolhaas is proud of in Lille? This is rush hour in a new Danish town. Maximum use. We can talk about the suburbs, and we can talk about this knowledge we have now. Is it used in the suburbs? It's not. We have a challenge here. We can talk about the developing countries. They are the ones which should use these humanistic principles the most. We have a long way to go, but also a lot of areas where we should work. This is slum clearance in Mumbai. Is this really what we can do in the developing countries? So, luckily we've just got the Arab version, and they are scared stiff in Dubai because they now have to look into this. This book was published in Oman, further south, and they say we'll publish it because they need it so desperately in Dubai. They published it. So, in Spanish, you have 3 of the books, so I'm very confident that there will be no problem in the Spanish-speaking world forever and ever. Thank you very much.
Okay. Now is the time of questions or reflections or ideas in relation to two speakers. In relation to the speakers or in relation to any problematic related to them. Okay. Yeah. Luis, you can talk with this. Yeah.
In your experience, what kind of evidence is most persuasive with municipal decision makers?
That's an excellent question. And if I talk about the health department, obviously they have a bias toward quantitative research. And it's, I've been fighting, debating, trying to make them understand that it's not true that hundreds, thousands of researchers on this planet are doing bad qualitative research just for the fun of it. So that the important thing is to evaluate the quality of this research, and it could be good qualitative, good quantitative, and the important thing is convergent evidence. But I must admit that in the medical world, and that's a bias also in some journals, they will, namely, some of them write you back saying they don't publish qualitative research. It's as simple as that. So there's a big work to do on our side also, those of us doing qualitative research, as I said this morning, to put more information, to make it publishable, and make it recognized as evidence. But for now, to answer your question, I think there's a bias toward quantitative research, at least in the health sector.
I have a comment also here. There are very, very excellent research combined with poor communication. There are bad research combined with excellent communication. Both of these are not very good. I found that it's so important that you do proper research, but then you do very careful communication in words, in books, in articles, in graphics, illustrate your points, so that it's not a sort of a secret language of the researchers. So much research is almost impossible to understand. And I have, of course, with my very meager background of being an autodidact, never having learned anything about research, but in School of Architecture I learned about communication and clarifying and putting your minds down in diagram and all that. And that is what I've used to get my mediocre research across. And I found that research, communication is 50% of everything. And many researchers, they are not unknown because they cannot get it out there. So I think that a lot should be done about how you present it. We have, of course, as you showed, a lot of articles which was peer-reviewed in magazines which only your enemies are reading, generally. Your mother and your enemies. But it's so important also that we communicate to ordinary people and to politicians and fellow architects and planners, whatever. And then it's another language which have fewer references and are more to the point. Then somebody can go back to the source and find the more solid thing, because the solid thing has to be there. But if it doesn't come out over the edge, it could as well has not been written.
Questions?
Hi, I have a question for Mr. Gale. I'd like to know a little bit more. I know you're working with the IDB in Latin American cities, and I'd like to listen a little bit more about your experience in cities of Latin America. And in this meeting, I saw you talked about transport, and I'd like to listen a little bit of your opinion on the velocity of investments that came. First of all, investments in growing cities were in cars, and now are in private transport, and now they're putting the money on public transport, but the crossing aspects between transport and the human scale on city are still kind of missing. And it seems that consultancy is not enough. So how, if you have a thought or any strategy on this way to how to do things that money goes also for pedestrians, and that things can be done in a crossing way, a collaborative way. Thank you.
My experience in Central and South America, I can cover very quickly. I've never worked there, personally. People from our office have worked there. We have people from Brazil and from Argentina and from other South and Central American cultures in our various offices, and they're working there. As you can see, I have mostly worked in Australia, New Zealand, America, Russia. I'm a specialist in Russia and Eastern countries because they love men over 60. And most of the people in our office are women under 40. And so they really can need me for Moscow and Kazakhstan, and we've just been to Uzbekistan. They love men over 60. So we send the younger, beautiful girls to South and Central America. I haven't worked there personally, but I've traveled there widely. And one of my very good friends is Enrique Peñalosa. And I have admired what he did, some of the things he did in his first period. I'm so curious to see what he makes out of his second period. Also, of course, I've been in Curitiba and studied the work of Jamie Lerner, and in a number of other places I have visited and seen the places, but now I've not really worked there.
Señor Baeza.
Thank you very much, both of you. Your presentations were great. There is a question for Mr. Gill. You encourage us to use the bicycle in the proper way in the city. But I observe that here, maybe at least in Barcelona, there is a conflict in the use in the public space between the cycles, between the use of the bicycle and the pedestrians. Most of the times there is conflict. They are like fighting because they are sharing the same space in the city. Yes, in Barcelona, yeah, of course. Yeah. That is why I asked this question: how we can resolve this? Why there is some places that it works fine, and what can we do in cities that is not working in the correct way? There is a record of health injuries caused by the accidents between pedestrians and bicycles, and I think it's the correct way to leave the car far away from the city. But what can we do with the next conflict between pedestrians and bicycles in the same space? Thank you.
If we go 50 years back, well, I'll just tell you a little story from real life. The first studies I ever did about people's behavior in cities, I did in Italy, in a number of Italian cities 50 years ago. Just recently I was back to those cities again to see how do these places look today. And there was one significant difference. There were bicycles in all the places. There were no bicycles 50 years ago. There are bicycles also in Barcelona. If you go back, there's always been some bicycles, some crazy pots who took the chance. But now you have bicycle paths and you have renting bicycles and whatever. So that is a sign all over the world now that bicycling is really on its way up. It is smart, it's good for the health, it's good for the climate, it's good for the purse, and it's convenient. And the cities are gradually learning to make the bicycle system safer and safer. I mentioned that from Copenhagen. They have worked very cleverly with this for a very long time. And gradually they found that's where the problem is, and we must make it safe, or it's not for the children and the grown-up and the elderly, it's only for the daredevils and the sort of the extreme sport people. So I'm sure that there will be gradually an improvement more and more so that it becomes completely safe also to bicycle in Barcelona. Barcelona is a very obvious good place for bicycling. It's very compact. You got wide streets, there's room enough, and you have a nice climate. So it could be bicycle city number 2 after Singapore.
Yeah, that is why I asked, because they are not working fine.
It takes time.
Yeah,
that's
maybe.
what I learned.
But how can we understand it? Because I use your theory, 5 kilometers per hour, the scale of the humans, and the bicycle is more than 5 kilometers, and they are sharing the same space. I'm really keen on that idea. I want to develop this idea, but I'm worried about that because I want to improve it. What's your opinion? How can we resolve? What is the strategy to resolve this problem exactly, in your opinion?
Are you the mayor of Barcelona?
No, sir, no.
Oh,
but I am worried about that.
I'm sorry, because I brought for the mayor the Copenhagen strategy for the best city in the world for people, and the Copenhagen strategy for the best city in the world for bicycles. And because the mayor is not here, maybe you can have them for a while and give them to the mayor. Here you are.
Thank you, sir.
There are quite a bit of literature on how to make bicycle systems good.
Yeah.
And you can get quite a few of it in English from the Copenhagen City website.
Okay. I want to comment a bit about this relation between communication and research. research and communication. That you say 50, I agree with your proposal. But I think that in the middle, there is the politics. Politics is in the middle of the two. It's not that who are doing research, they are bad communication. They are bad communication because they cannot do good communication in a lot of places.
So they go
Then,
into research, okay.
yeah, and then I will explain one thing. Today happened a very strange thing here. Some students came to me that went down to the library of the Association of Architects to buy your books. And they say, somebody take all the books of Jan Gehl out, buy everything this morning at 9. There is no books of Jan Gehl here today, because a woman take out a lot of books, buy, and then this is the research communication. Here in Spain, this happens all the time. You make a communication of your research in the La Vanguardia, and they say, no, don't talk. You cannot criticize Dubai here. No. I say that in the middle, there is politics. It's not only that the blame is the person that make the research that is a bad communicator. A lot of time is that.
I'm sure you can buy all the books at the black market later this afternoon.
Yeah, no. It's possible. And also it's possible that the woman that buy all the books was for the Catalan Agency of Housing in Catalonia. But not to criticize, no, to use the books and in between the politicians. It's not, now they are very interested in you, but they wanted to do the work without any relation with university at all, but in the way. But it's very strange, because the head of the library says, it's very strange, we have no books now, because it's just half an hour, somebody take all the books. But all the books that has nothing to do with the conference.
What was all the books? 3 books?
No, I don't know. I
30
don't.
books.
They have 4 or 5 books, and normally in the library they have each book 3 or 4. They don't take hundreds of books. No, but it's just that the participants in the conference say, well, and now I am going to buy the book. No, somebody buy all the books, and then they are frustrated. And then this person that buy the books is not here, disappear. And then, of course, that's the strange thing. But what they are saying is this happens in Spain. It's not like in other countries. It's different. Here, the relation between research and communication is very controlled, extremely watched. It's not like it's free, but you need to be careful. But I know that we should do the 4 in the same way, but it's not easy now here. You say how Barcelona is not in the top, perhaps because we need to work more in communication in this way, and perhaps little by little, I think it's changing a lot here also. But they take time, because it's not easy to go from one part of the other. And in South America, you ask the same thing. I think they know that this is the same thing. In Colombia, they are doing blogs. It's one government agency, one that make all the blogs of Colombia. And then all the Colombians know that is the head, who is the head of that. And then, of course, you publish things in the university and they say, okay, be careful, because there is a political relation between these two. That doesn't mean that communication is basic. I agree with you. And also that a lot of research stops with the metaphysical ideas, philosophical ideas, and this is not enough. You need to go, and this is a fantastic work to arrive to the manual of use, no? And this is important in communication. But the thing is, of course, is the funding and a lot of things. I agree with you completely, but the situation sometimes is difficult. Yeah, 3 persons. And Enrique.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your lectures. I just wanted to ask about scale, because the key kind of seminal project that you talk about, Jan, is Copenhagen. And how do these projects work when they get applied to a city of a much larger scale, like London? And I mean, are you mainly focusing on the centre of the city? Because by improving the centre of the city, that quite often generates more urban gentrification, which excludes people. So I think the question is, how do these projects, when they get scaled up and applied to a city on a much wider kind of level, how do they work? And this question of, just by improving the centre, do you push people out, you know, further and further out of the city by creating these sort of cappuccino squares?
Firstly, about the size of the places. As far as I know, all the things I've worked on studied, can be applied everywhere where Homo sapiens is living. And you can easily use them in a little village with 200 people, and you can use them in Moscow with 15, 16 million people. So it's about Homo sapiens primarily, and there's not that much difference whether you're in Greenland or in New Zealand or in Japan or in South America. I found, even in Arabic countries, I found that many of the basic things which relates to our human biology and our history of biological history, they are the same all over. Then we have cultural differences. That's one part of question. Also, with the size of cities, of course, I found that we found some interesting things, that all city centers are about 2 square kilometers. And why that? That's because that's how far people can walk. So in the old days, they all ended up 1 by 1 kilometer or 1.5 by 1.5, whatever. And in the bigger cities like New York and London and also Moscow, you'll find that the city is actually divided in a number of city centers. In New York, there are maybe 10 city centers of reasonably scale inside just Manhattan. But the other part of the question, that was about gentrification. And I know about this very much because I've been in very many debates where people say, you come here and make this city a wonderful, livable place. And then people will not move away from this city. They stay after they studied. And people come flocking in from the suburbs to live in this nice place. We have this in Copenhagen. And then the prices go up and we see this gentrification. So the logic is, don't make cities nice for God's sake. Make them as bad as you can, and then you can prevent gentrification. That, of course, is completely unacceptable. So I said, make cities as best you can, and if you have this phenomenon, make sure that you apply these qualities to more and more districts in the surrounding areas, so there's not 1 district, but 10 districts with this kind of qualities. Because it's basic qualities for human well-being, and they should not be reserved for a little group, it should be for more. Don't go the other way and make things as bad you can. There's no future in that. And furthermore, I mean that the gentrification should be solved not by the urban designers, but by the politicians, by demanding that substantial number of existing and new buildings should remain with affordable housing. That's a political issue.
Rick.
Thank you. Let me come back to the question of the books that Montagnola says before. I have another theory. It has been Jan who buy all the books to sell in the black market this afternoon to improve the selling. I'm sorry, I have discovered your play.
I asked a girl I know to do it for me, a straw man.
Well, a part of the joke, I am an environmental psychologist. I am not architect. But you three, you have been in contact with architectural psychology, environmental psychology. During you have started saying we have not to come back to 70s. But maybe the question is that probably we have to come back to the subject of the 70s in the research. But we have a strong problem that it's an epistemological problem. It's not an object problem of the research. You have been talking about the symptoms of the problems, but not about the strong causes of these problems. Then, implicitly, one of the subjects of the 70s was very recurrent, the question about architectural determinism or environmental determinism. Then if we put the conditions, we will have the good behaviors, the good feeling of people, etc. And of course, that it's not like that. And the check of architectural psychology at the end of the 70s, it has been related with that. Because architecture is not considered science. It's then you have more freedom to do research in from not in all approaches, but psychology in this moment become more and more scientific and try to establish very simple causation relationships. And we forget the cultural, we forget the economical, we forget the sociological dimensions that are in the background. Then we can give some conditions, and that may increase the cycles, it may increase some kind of, but I can remember the last time that you have been here, Carol, we were talking outside and you make the comment about people used to work in the city, people is not so fat, people, etc. And that was surprising you in this moment. But I think the big attractive of the city of Barcelona is not the monuments, it's the monuments plus the social dynamics. And when we are analyzing the symptoms, sometimes we forget that the more nuclear things are the social dynamics, and that means the social nets, the presential social nets, not the virtual social nets, the presential social nets that give the support to people. Then I think it's not possible to understand the present dynamics of the cities without this analysis, this macro dynamics, macroeconomical dynamics sometimes, that are more interested in build big buildings more than small activities from people. In our research, we have found as people that who is living in neighborhoods that has been restored, decrease the use of public space because they feel they have not contributed, they have not arranged, they have not appropriate this space. And this is the questions that I don't know, from your point of view, 50 years later, if the contribution of architectural psychology is valid at present, or you have to look to other places.
That's for you.
That's an interesting comment. I think it's not a question really that you're proposing, but more a comment. It is true that I said that we shall not go back to the 70s while social sciences was supposed to enlighten the architect to find better solution in a linear process. This being said, the research that was produced in the 70s, and Louise has referred to Kevin Lynch, there's a lot of work that was done at the time, which was initiated by architects and psychologists getting together and exchanging about the bad quality of the environment, and decided to do something about it. So the idea was to definitely apply the knowledge. And I will give the example of the mental map of Kevin Lynch, because I realize that most of people know Kevin Lynch here. The other day I saw a lot of hands raised. And the mental map was about not to see the city from a plane, and to see it from the perspective of its inhabitant. And it is still very much...
From a car window.
It is still very much used to teach architect. It has been improved by architect. Now we have edges that have been added to the theory, and prompts or urban, there is a nice fellow, Australian fellow who did his PhD on this concept and make it even more appropriable for architects. So environmental psychologists continue to work on cognitive mapping, which they call not city map now, but cognitive mapping. So you see already not the bias, but this idea of being more analyzed from the point of view of the cognition and not its use. And you find less studies now. It's like they're getting trapped into knowledge development, but which is okay, which is still okay. We all do fundamental research, but has lost the side of application, maybe. A lot of, in the chapter I was talking about that I published after giving this talk, actually Henrik is the editor of that handbook of environmental psychology. I do a review of all the wonderful concepts put forward by environmental psychology, a lot of books that you showed on the screen. And these concepts are very useful teaching the student now. They were made, let's say I talk about Robert Sommer and personal space, there's a lot of these concepts that were put forward to analyze the built environment and make it better. Now it's like the research has developed in different fields, environmental psychology, but sociology or geography in its own. And now it's like we're losing track of applying the research, and I think we should always wear the two hats, being able to develop fundamental research, but also think about how we could apply it. So to answer your question, I think there are less useful concepts that are put forward now compared to the 70s. So we should go back to the 70s, you're right, but with a better understanding of how architects work. And instead, and the problems are even more complex now. We see it with sustainability, how big they are, is instead of trying as one researcher to wear all the hats, which I did for my PhD, which a lot of students do during their PhDs because they don't have the money to do otherwise, it's time to work together. But I'm on sabbatical now, and I've been traveling for 3 months in different universities. And I go to environmental psychology department, oops, they don't work with architects. I go in architectural department, oops, they don't work with psychologists. I go to public health institution, they're all epidemiologists working on the city, they don't have one single architect. So what I was saying is that there are still silos. So going back to the 70, for the spirit of what research was made for, but work together now because it's very rare to be able now to handle everything at once. We have to start working together. Not sure I answered your question, but not sure it was a question.
Let me be a little criticist with Montagnola. I think one of the problems is that your generation, that you were very sensible about these kind of subjects, you have not formalized in the education program inside of schools of architecture these kind of subjects. And there was a very important to formalize that inside your program.
You know, and maybe some of you can react to that, but in North America, we have an accreditation board. You know, if you want to be a school of architecture and graduate architects, you have to answer about 40 objectives in terms of their training. And every time it's revised, we're losing objective in terms of training architects to understand human behavior. I see Louise will react to that. We saw a survey going on all of us saying, can you write back and say why this objective should be kept? And this is very scary because now you have all the numerical, how do you say, architecture numérique, you know, the new technology influencing architecture, and it's taking a lot of place in the program now, and people are pushing for that, while I see not that much application right away to improve the quality of people's life. So I think when I was saying this morning we have to be a little political, get some power at the head of department, but also deal with these associations that are regulating what the training of an architect should be. And for now, it's a mold, and everybody has to go through that mold, and architects have to be cloned on the same template.
Yeah, this is because the students are down for this reason. The students of architecture are reacting to this. The students, not the professors at all. The professors, they want this. In he knows, in the program of PhD program in the School of Architecture, it's forbidden to enter one person without the title of architecture in the design department. They decided that no person, that only architects can do a PhD in design. Then the consequence is no interaction, this in the sense of academy, in the university, Polytechnic University. But then there is a strange process that is very nice. He said, we cannot make ugly cities in order to be down the price, you said. That is a nice process. It is, of course, it's stupid. Said, no, we need to make very bad design in order that the people, poor people, can live there. If we do good design, then poor people is going out, and this is negative. But you see, this is the process in a lot of problems you said. When you said the cars outside the sidewalks, that's very clear. In Moscow, in Barcelona, why the cars are in the sidewalks? But disaster, totally disaster, or interdisciplinary research. The total disaster of the design of architects. You should go to the square behind the Plaza de la Boqueria now, no? With the Carmen Pinot's building. Is a disaster, the space. Disaster, totally disaster. Then we are making disaster, and then we are doing bad the things, and then you say, the cars outside, and the city hall says, of course, cars outside. Why during years and years the cars are are very bad? The thing is, the process of taking the decisions in the sense of research on urban planning is so bad because there is no psychologist, no sociologist, nothing, no in the urban planning departments and the architecture. That is so bad that then you came to say it's obvious that this everybody says yes, the politicians yes, because it's clear this is very bad. No, you take very clear options to improve. And you are right, because it's scandalous in these places that has been so bad. But then the combination between research and become a bit schizophrenic, and you say, because you, no, we need to leave the cars there because we need to make studies first to prove that the cars in the that is completely is not necessary. That means that the communication has been breaking down, no, between research and the communication route. And this breakdown, the only advantage is then you come out and you say, you see the problem immediately, and they accept, because it's so clear that there are decisions that are bad. The problem with the bikes and the pedestrians in Barcelona is very easy to solve, but you need to make regulations in the crossing between pedestrians that they don't accept. There are 3 persons killed by bikes in Barcelona in the last year, because they don't control the speed of the bikes, and they don't see. You cross and you don't see the bike now. Now in the newspaper there is a person that made a stick before and then break the bikes, because if you cross you are killed. Then I put the stick before and then I don't kill. See, and this, but there is no reaction. The city hall says, well, this is impossible to. It's very easy.
I would like to move away from the bicycles.
Yeah.
A bit. We have talked about research and architecture, and I was thinking about something completely different. That was the influence of individuals without research on the world, like Curitiba, where Jamie Lerner, because he was an architect, he had that training, he developed some ideas, and he was a strong personality, and he was able, as the only city in South America, to make another kind of planning which proved to be very successful. That was very much because of maybe his training and his ability for leadership. And that points to another thing, that there are many, very, very few architects. Some years ago, we tried to make a conference. That was the American ambassador in Denmark, Richard Sweat. He was an architect and he was ambassador and was member of the Senate or something over there before. And he was so occupied with what he called design diplomacy, that architects should use their creativity and their knowledge of society to go into politics, to get out of the ivory towers and come down and be dirty on their fingers and influence the cities and the countries. So we decided to make a big conference of all the architect mayors in the world, and we could find 3. And then there was maybe a member of a parliament here, and there was a few guys there, and there were some architects who have in their later days started to be social, like Richard Rogers, but it was so difficult to find architects who got into the machinery of power and decision making, which I think is another area where there is some phobia about. We sit here in the ivory tower, they can do their dirty stuff down there. I'll tell you one more example of, in Copenhagen, very good reason why so many good things that happen in Copenhagen is that we've had for a very long period a very, very sensible traffic engineer. He believed that traffic engineers' major problem was to keep the traffic out. And he come up with a number of good ideas, like if they can't park, they won't drive. And then he started to take parking out of the city center and saying, if I take parking out very slowly and don't tell it, nobody will notice it. He did that for 25 years, very slowly changed the pattern of use of the city. Instead of driving in, it was more and more complicated. You could take the bike or you could take the metro. So he was a guy who, from a political point of view, and with some good ideas, were able to influence. He had no signs, because if you can't park, you won't drive. I think that was rather obvious. But that's example. I really think that we have studied this in various places, and it's so wonderful to see those people who have the power, the creativity, imagination to be leaders. And many of the cities which have done good work, like Oriol Bohigas in Barcelona, like Barbara something in Strasbourg, like Jamie Lerner in Curitiba, Enrique in Bogota. They are individuals with a vision, who have the ability to move the world. Maybe they can be supported by research. I know that Enrique Peñalosa would always weigh my books and say, what I'm saying is right. That's proved in science. But I think it's very interesting, these individual firebrands who can push the world.
I will continue on that, but maybe I'd like to have some comments from people in the room. Where I see a lot of hands raised. I want to talk to the young generation, because yes, there is the traditional, yes, political power, but my most comforting thing as a professor who has been teaching 30 years now is to see the generation of architects to whom I have taught, who have learned participatory processes, who have learned to read research, start their own NGOs, so non-governmental association, and they are activists now. And they have a division of research, and they do continuous training for the population, and they are lobbying the governments, and they're doing a wonderful job. Just go and see the site of Vivre en Ville in Quebec, and Accès Transport Viable, one in transportation, the other one in housing. They're wonderful. So there are other channels to appropriate political power, and I think the next generation is breaking the rule a bit, which I love. So I would like you, I saw you raising your hand, so why don't you continue on what I'm saying?
You need a microphone.
Yes.
Well, if it's on the same topic, you can start, and then we'll give the...
Okay, don't know. I wanted to make a question, but probably after the other,
okay.
The other one.
It's going around.
Goodbye.
Hello. Well, first of all, thank you for the lecture, and I want to say about some compliment that Montagnola says about the education here in the PhD. I'm an architect. I'm a Mexican architect. I studied a PhD in sustainability in Polytechnical, and there's different because I'm an architect, but we also have many biologists, environmentalists, economists, geographists, and many others. You know, so we are changing this paradigm of how the things have to be, and I like how it's going. Right now, the concept of sustainability is still a little ambiguous, but we are changing in this area. And me as an architect, I also have some other friends doing researching about sustainability and about the livable cities. Now I'm doing some researching for my city in north of Mexico. So I'm from Ciudad Juárez, so it's a kind of a tough city. Well, it's a beautiful city, but it's a city where we can define in some way as social hostility right now. So we are trying to do some stuff about it. But I agree what Jan says about the changes that Jamie Lerner is doing. He also came like 2 years ago and do some lecture in YAC about the cities and about all the changes what are doing. And about all this, I also, well, first to compliment one that Montañolas that Josep says, and also there's a question for Jan that I want to know, like, about someone says something about the scale. I want to ask about the cities. What is related with the scale and the human scale, but also about the cultural part. What has been the most difficult or the problems that you'll find to make some changes in a city within the cultural part, you know, the cultural factor. Like, for example, the example that you have now in Christian Church in New Zealand. You know, I want to know about this and how can bring this and extrapolate this to my city, and how to bring some other part of forms or way of participation as not just a PhD students or something. We want to get more further than that and try to reach some other point of impact to the city.
Would you repeat the name of your city? I didn't.
Ciudad Juárez.
Sorry?
Ciudad Juárez.
Ciudad Juárez.
It's in the north.
North of Mexico.
It's in the border. It's right in the border with Mexico. It's in the border between Chihuahua and Texas.
Yeah, I tried to make one point, that is that the major thing which happened with modernism, that we gave up building spaces and started to be leftover spaces, and focused, instead of spaces, we focused on buildings. That was a big change in the way city planning and architecture was working. And also at that point, we had the invasion of the motor car. And in my point of view, one of the things which suffered in this transition was that the ability by architects and planners to handle human scale or scale was completely confusing, forgotten. So that we really have now several generations of architects and planners who have no sense for human scale and no sense of making 5 kilometers an hour. And so the whole notion of scale has been exploded. And that, in my point of view, that we have no spaces and we have no sense of scale, that makes the new towns so awful all around. And that's also the explanation why we can always clean up in the old towns where the scale is all right, but we have very difficulties in handling scale in the new towns. And the understanding that we need spaces to really function as human beings, which is a subject which is hardly investigated, by the way. So there's a very nice PhD lying there. What is the importance of space, of defined space?
Thank you.
I could also just add that in our office we are making a new book called Great New Towns of the 21st Century. It is the thinnest book you ever saw. We have around the world, in all countries, we have been searching and found about 6 places which are worthy to go into a book of great new towns. People cannot make new towns no more.
Right. Okay. I'm sorry for the other people that want to ask after. Yes, because I actually wanted to comment on the idea that Carol was trying to develop. So thank you very much, Carol, for bringing this issue of how engaging participation. No? Because I was actually thinking about this, and it's a question that I wanted to do to Jan about. Okay, we're talking all the time about these top-down interventions, but what about this, how much have you thought or about these bottom-up processes, no, of participatory processes that can also improve cities and social life. Because I was thinking, and I had this thought that was like bothering me, you know, thinking, okay, maybe the most livable city in the world, that's Copenhagen, it's at the same time one of the countries with highest rates of suicide in Europe, no? So
it's because of the weather.
Yeah, probably.
Don't talk about the weather.
Yeah,
Social Democrats.
What I wanted to say is that it's evident that the Forum of Cities is not correlated to like the happiness and living states of people, no? And I was actually very interested in what he was saying, like about these social nets, or like the importance of these like social dynamics to make life better in a way, no? So my thought is that yes, I agree that it's probably bottom-up activities and participatory processes, something in architecture and by architects that can actually improve these social nets, no? And improve like social life, and which is at the end making people happier and better and more connected and more integrated, more than this. I mean, I absolutely agree that it's important, no, to improve cities also top down, but I think that if the issue is how much at the end are we improving people's life, I think that it has more to do with this like social relationships that can also be like impulsed through bottom-up practices.
So that was your question, Marta.
Well, I wanted to like yeah, that was.
But
my question.
Copenhagen is a very interesting example because what happens from up above is mainly because the people in the city are informed and they demand better quality. And the politicians are very keen in listening what is going on. So when you have a population which wants a better quality of built environment, then you can be sure to have politicians who want to do that. So it may look like upside down, but it's both ways. And really informing the people is the best tool of all of them, so that they can realize there are other things you can ask for than more cars or whatever. And they have done this here, they've done that there. We could as well do this here. That will influence the politicians. So I really think that's the way to go from bottom up. Also, there could be NGOs, and there could be, like in New York, a very strong alternative transportation group who worked for bicycling and was instrumental in pushing in that direction. So that's some of the things I have experienced. I mentioned, before, and in my talk also I mentioned the mayor of Moscow, who definitely had great power. So had the mayor of New York, the same kind of power. In London, the mayor had no power, so nothing happened. So there are definitely various ways to approach these things, but the best thing is to influence the mindset of the ordinary people, because then things will change.
Thank you very much.
And to influence mindset, you will have to communicate very clearly so you can influence many mindsets, not only few.
Thank you.
Just one thing, you mentioned this about the suicide, yeah. But also the Danes are the most happy people in the world. Not anymore, because the Norwegians now are a little bit better. But also we have very dark winters, but we are still very happy.
My question was just about the effort to influence the minds of the people, because during the 30s, the 30 years after the Second World War, the modernism and the motorism had a great success in developing our cities according to the capitalistic forces, because they could find low-income houses for workers and so on. Now, with the crisis, unfortunately, the great developers and the capitals of entrepreneurs still work for this kind of city, especially in the great transformation of abandoned urban areas in the Western world. And their investments in the media systems, in images of this kind of cities is huge. To fight against this kind of imagery is quite difficult, in my opinion. I tried to focus out a sort of mediatic campaign about the great urban transformation, and there's a great lack of images about an alternative view of the city. It is a sort of fight of David against Goliath. It's a little bit difficult. I don't know if I'm sure to understand, but I think that we miss a sort of, there's a lack of a poetic imagery of our cities, which can fight against the classical idea of the cities as it comes out from the past years.
I like what you say, because I've been involved in the planning of the public transport plan at the City of Quebec and several other tools that the city is putting together. And I've been fighting against a vision that was dominating the panel, which was the center of the city and the outer suburbs. And to me, it's outdated now, because 60% of the population of the City of Quebec live in post-war suburb. You have 20% in 5% of the territory, and you have the rest in the rural area. So it is more than time to start to have a polynuclear vision of a city and start working with that, linking these different neighborhoods. And I like the fact that Jan finished his presentation showing images of these suburbs that are growing up now. And I'm even going to be critical about these eco-neighborhoods that are being built now, because people think they're going to solve the problem, but there's a lot of problem with the facade of the building and the edge of the streets, you know, so it's not that eco, to my opinion. It's eco-environmentally, you have all type of LEED technology, but in terms of social sustainability and economic sustainability, I'm not sure about that. So anyway, I think I agree with you. It's time to revise the theory of urban form, because it's not like we're building from scratch now. We're rebuilding, as I said, the heritage of this modernist period that you're talking about, to me, is our biggest challenge. You mentioned it also. And it's not the same scale. You talk about scale. In Quebec, the largest determinant, the most significant determinant of teenagers walking or biking is the distance between the school and the house. It's getting just out of reach. You know, it takes too much time and it's too far. So it's a question of scale, and you have to think about alternatives, you know. So yes, I agree with you. I don't have the solution, but that's why my research group was founded, to work on post-war suburbs, to make sure that we redevelop them, because they need to be redeveloped, to make sure we attract the young generation to live there instead of going in faraway suburbs, because they don't want to live downtown. That's not what they're looking for. And there is also the developers who are planning dropping towers also in Quebec, you know, which is another problem, which is absolutely not the one the young generation wants. And I did a large internet survey, 3,000 respondents in the City of Quebec, and it's the last thing people want is a tower, living in a tower, you know. So I think we have to work on knowing what people's representation of a good city and a good living is. We have to work with that to understand what people want and not just impose some images, but the suburbs, the heritage of the great 30s is really where we should be working now. Thank you for your...
Yeah, I was thinking when you put this question, I have one suggestion where you can go and see a very interesting solution to, seemingly a solution to many of the problems you talk about. In Melbourne, they have 3 million people, most of them in suburbs. They are planning, or they can foresee that there will be 6 million people. And the very brilliant city architect of Melbourne, Rob Adams, he's made a plan where you can save all the suburbs you can have 3 million more people in the city without expanding the city, and you can have a much higher density and a density of service so that the aging population can have more service, whatever. And basically what his plan is to take all the transport corridor, take down a small percentage of the single family house and put up 7-story houses like in Cerda Quarter here in Barcelona along the transport corridors and turn them into service centers. Then everybody would live close to walking distance to a service and walking distance to transportation. So it's something about we have to live much more dense. We have to live in cities where we can walk and bike and get rid of all this dependency on energy to get around, and then have very energy efficient mobility modes, which will be some kind of linear stuff. The driverless car, I think, is a great idea for the transport industry, for the automobile industry. Whatever here. It's a great idea for the industry, but I think that the fact that you can have twice as many cars in a city like this one, if you have driverless cars, is not at all anything about quality. It's about quantity and about selling more cars and more gimmicks to people. And many of the ideas of smart city is in the same department of selling gimmicks to a number of people rather than looking for the basic qualities of life for children, for young people, for adults, and for the growing community of elderly people who will have to spend a lot of their day walking around and bicycling to have a good life and to keep fit until the last day. So there are models, they're not built, but Melbourne is a good way. Melbourne homepage, City of Melbourne, is a good way to start to be inspired. I was very inspired by this plan to double the number of people and get rid of the problems of the suburbs in one big operation.
Okay,
Can I just add one little word that I agree with you, but the problem is like Melbourne is growing. In Quebec, we have a city that's stagnating in terms of population, and that's going to be shrinking. So where do we take the money? When you have the capital to build and redo, so the problem is now we don't have that capital. How many of you are from a city where growth is not the top thing on the list? Only one person? You're all in Barcelona, a growing city? Raise your hand, the one that are not in a city growing fastly. So most of you live in big cities, obviously. But come to Quebec, you'll see people of my age are dominating the sidewalks, unfortunately. But anyway, I don't know if we have time. There was this guy waiting.
Well, the last one.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for your issue. I'm sorry by my English. I try to explain my question. And is the next, what happened in cities with nature or with our relationship with nature compared with village? Which is the difference really between the nature that we have in the cities and the nature that we have in village? Because I feel more living the village than the city for me, for myself. So what can we do to do more village the city, or I don't know, or we have to keep asphalt and put grass, or no? What do you think about the relationship between nature and in the city, or is just push tree where you need shadow, or parks, or what do you think?
It's a very cultural question. I reviewed a PhD thesis from somebody in Australia where the student wanted so much to tell that people wanted green, green, green. And honestly, the person she interviewed liked to walk on a nice city street with trees, but they didn't want necessarily a park. So the social fabric that Henrik was talking about and that one of the person in the room was reacting to, sometimes they will like a space with shade and green, but they will like the social life. And architects often translate the need for greenery into contemplative space. And it's the same thing for older people. We think that they want to live in an apartment overlooking a park. They're bored. They don't want that. In my interviews, I found older people that prefer looking at the parking lot because they see activities. That's a problem of our city in Quebec. That's not the ideal situation, I agree. But that means that social life is very important. This being said, with climate change in Quebec, want it or not, they are planting. They are replacing asphalt with permeable, it doesn't mean grass, but it means a permeable surface. And I think because the science is there, the engineering science, it's going to happen. How it is going, this is material for architects and urban designers to do better, because there's this momentum. They will plant anyway, so we shall be there to tell them how to do it properly, because it's a unique moment. We don't have to convince that much about the appropriateness of greening. Pretty much everybody agrees. The manner of greening, though, is different from one culture to another, from what I've read. I'm not a specialist of nature. Louise could tell you more.
Okay, then we need to finish. The next Congress title is The Human Condition of Architecture, the next year. Then we will not solve here what is the human condition in general, but it's clear that if we can make a joint effort between research, design, and politics, if the three can make a human communication or a human interaction, I think that we can improve the cities, all of that. I think that everybody that is working now in a lot of universities trying to do the best way to do one of the three things now, it's clear that we have developed in the last 50 years more tools, like Jean-Gel has done, and that we have perhaps more knowledge about what is happening now that some years ago. But that still we have a long work because the human condition changes in time and in space and very fast. It's for that I insist about the situation in the School of Architecture that is completely new in Barcelona. It's the first time that the students are against the head of the school for mental reasons, cultural reasons, not for political involvement of right or left. But they are sure that what I mean is that I agree with Professor Gell that there are minds that are clever and architects that are clever, and you cannot try to make general catalogs in order to solve the thing without this capability of the designer or of the politician or the research to find the solutions. You cannot substitute the brain of the architect, of the politicians, or of the scientific research to substitute that for some kind of general system, mathematics system, digital system. Now there are a lot of congresses on that. This cannot be substituted. And of course, the more architects participate in the three lines, research, politics, education, mind, line, society, the more they participate, the best for everybody. I think that, and we need to solve a lot of problems in the programs, and are very similar problems in a lot of universities that you are there. This afternoon at 3 o'clock there is a lot of sessions, and the party at 8 o'clock in the school. And then thank you to all.